that being the situation we are in, being in this strange state of affairs, it would be interesting to go on with the same theme of the pandemia, but now today's webinar, directed specifically at the problem of fieldwork. So we entitled this webinar, Fieldwork in an Era of Pandemia, Digital and Other Alternatives. So we were thinking of discussing amongst colleagues worldwide, what is the situation? What are the alternatives also to this problem? And as I said, since WOW and WCAA and IOAS are all international associations, we always aim to have a wide range of colleagues from all over the world participating. Last time we had someone from China, we had people from different countries in Europe, we had a colleague from Brazil, we had a colleague from California. And so today we'll have different countries, different colleagues to make more clear how we want to make this a worldwide anthropological venture, joint venture. So today we have as guests speaking on this theme, and I'm going to follow the same logic as last time, going from east to west. So first we have our colleague from Australia, Pamela McGrath. Then we have our colleague from Japan, Shiaki Kondo, and I hope I'm saying the names all correct. Then we were supposed to have our colleague from India, Nandini Sundar. Unfortunately, she cannot make it because her father is in the hospital. So we wish he recovers fast. And we thank Nandini anyway, because she started off being in the group, but unfortunately she had to pull out. And then we will have our colleague from the UK, Daniel Miller, and then we'll have our colleague from Mexico, Aida Hernandez. So the questions for this discussion, the specific questions that we set out so that we could all think about it, were what technology is there to allow anthropologists to do research and fieldwork when we cannot do face-to-face participant observation? What are the advantages and disadvantages of interviewing people online? Should we reconsider armchair anthropology? How could we access unpublished data that we could work on while in a pandemia? And should we reconsider large data sets or surveys? Of course, these are just some of the sub-themes we can consider here. Everyone is more than welcome to bring in their own thoughts, their new ideas about this. So, of course, I thank you all very much for being here, for wanting to participate on this. I think it's important, and it's important for WCAA and for WOW to have this worldwide webinars, especially in a time where we cannot meet face-to-face. So we will start with our colleague from Australia, Pamela. So Pam McGrath is at the Australian National University. She's an adjunct fellow with ANUS, National Center for Indigenous Studies, and she has been involved with native title claim research, policy analysis, and the teaching of native title anthropology for almost 2 decades. Afterwards, we will have our colleague from Japan, Shiaki Kondo from Hokkaido University, and also from the Center for Ainu and Indigenous Studies at this same university in Japan, of course. His research interests include revitalization of hunting cultures, co-management and resource management issues, and the relations between digital technology and indigenous communities. Then we will have our colleague from the UK, Daniel Miller. I think he's very much known for his work on material culture, but he has also put out very recently a very, very interesting video on YouTube on how to conduct ethnography during, and the fact that social interaction is not there. So I think this directly connects with what we're going to be discussing today. But anyway, Daniel Miller, besides his work on material culture and social media, currently also directs a EU-funded project the anthropology of smartphones and smart aging. And his prior ERC-funded project entitled Why We Post resulted in a website with over 100 films and stories from the field sites. So I think that's also interesting for the theme that we have here today. Finally, last but not least, we will have our colleague from Mexico, Rosalda Aida Hernandez, from the Centro de Investigaciones, Estudios Superiores and Antropologia Social in Mexico City. She worked as a journalist, and her academic work has promoted indigenous and women's rights in Latin America, and she has also been working on digital and technological issues directly related with ethnographical research. So thank you very much once again. We will now start with Pamela, please. You have the word.
Great, thanks so much, Clara, and thank you to you and Michel for convening and for the opportunity to participate. The comments I'm going to offer tonight are specifically about the challenges of doing applied research with Indigenous Australians for native title, cultural heritage and land rights matters. So this is research that is specifically, there's three features that are particularly unique to this kind of research and that present particular challenges in the context of this global pandemic. And so that is that firstly, the research is predominantly place-based. It involves consultation and research with groups of people, not just individuals. And it's usually conducted under considerable time constraints. And that's because its main drivers, this research is done to inform legal proceedings, to help facilitate agreement making between Indigenous people and proponents of development, and also used in the context of cultural heritage protection. So it's quite a kind of tight, it's quite a tightly run kind of research. The constraints are quite tight. In preparation, I've spoken to a number of colleagues who work, that's anthropologists and lawyers who work with land councils around Australia. So they're the community organisations that provide the legal and research service to traditional owners. And then what they're telling me is that they're as busy as ever. The work isn't slowing down because of COVID-19, and to make matters worse, they're actually facing funding cuts as a result of the impending economic slowdown. So the federal court's continuing with court cases with some concessions to social distancing measures, such as doing relaxing of some timeframes, some holding of mediations, and taking of evidence in front of judges via teleconferencing or video conferencing. So there's some concessions, but overall, people are having.
You have to turn on your sound, Pam. You must have touched your sound key. Yes.
Okay, how's that?
That's fine.
And mining and exploration work is also being expedited. Well, it's continuing, but in some instances being expedited. So that work isn't stopping either. But obviously, field research with Indigenous peoples in these circumstances is very risky to the health of research collaborators, in particular older collaborators who are cultural custodians. So we need to find a way to do this research, but it needs to be safer. It also needs to be less expensive, and it needs to be just as efficient. So it's a pretty challenging situation, and all round colleagues are generally struggling to find ways to make this research happen without compromising the research integrity or the ethical frameworks in which it happens. just quickly, a bit of background about where we're at in Australia with COVID. We've been pretty good with flattening our curve relatively quickly. There's been just over 7,000 confirmed cases, and the 100th death was recorded today. And the restrictions are starting to be lifted, but it's a bit gently. As far as I'm aware, there hasn't been any outbreaks in Indigenous communities, which is great news. And what I'm hearing is that, in fact, Indigenous communities were among some of the first to move when hearing that the pandemic was coming our way. And that's in no small part due to the fact that there's been oral histories have continued to circulate about the devastating impact of the 1919 Spanish flu epidemic that really devastated a lot of Indigenous populations. So some of the specific challenges around doing place-based research in a COVID-safe way is really how to accurately document the location of significant places, which may include archaeological sites. How you do that at a distance, particularly in areas where there hasn't been prior research. The custodians of cultural knowledge about sites are usually older people at higher risk of COVID-19. The sites are often located hundreds of kilometres from the nearest town, and they require extended field trips to document and locate. And the relevant informants often live far apart and have quite mobile lives and are sometimes quite difficult to track down. So it's not easy work to do at the best of times. That's 5 minutes, Clara.
Pam, so we will now move to our colleague from Japan, Shiaki Kondo, please.
Yes. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
We hear you. Just try to speak as loud as you can, because it makes a sort of a metallic sound, but we can hear you. No problem.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. So I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this stimulating event. It's 10 p.m. Here in Sapporo, Japan, and I'm participating from my apartment and may experience slow connection since lots of people are using internet in my apartment. So I apologize in the beginning if you experience any inconvenience. So I have been working with indigenous hunters in interior Alaska, and since the middle of March, when the COVID-19 cases started to be identified in Alaska, I had conducted 2 weeks of digital ethnographic research, especially through Facebook. And what I did was very simple because I had to cancel my field trip to Alaska in March due to this pandemic. I decided to stay online as much as possible on Facebook using my iPhone, and and then keeping the chat conversation as some of my Alaskan friends talk to me. And I also saved screenshots of my people's Facebook posts and individually asked for the permission to use it in my research. Before this COVID-19, Facebook was a tool for me to get ready for fieldwork. I had posted on Facebook of my arrival and get information about who is where during my stay in Alaska. But now I'm thinking of Facebook as a data collection tool. My initial finding is that my Alaskan friends envision a double social distancing strategy as a way to cope with COVID-19. The first step is to disconnect the urban areas from the rural communities. In March, commercial flights between urban cities and rural communities seems to have been severely restricted, as village or city council talked with the small airplane company serving the community to do so. Another thing people talked about is the possibility of staying in fishing and hunting camp during the pandemic. Some elders posted on Facebook that it might be a good idea to stay away from village and live temporarily in a fishing or hunting camp. Here's one of the posts. I hope you guys, you all can see the photos, the screenshots. So here's one of the posts that I saved and received the permission from the elder, Peter Snow, to use it for my research. And he is discussing it might be a good idea for the younger people to stay away from a village and stay in the trapping cabin during the pandemic. Okay, so during the online chat-based interview, some of my friends mentioned that in the time of Spanish flu in the late 1910s, they did something similar by staying in hunting and fishing camp to keep distance from non-indigenous persons. In my opinion, this COVID-19 pandemic urges us to think more about digital nature of contemporary indigenous culture, where digital technology reshape and redefine what it means to be traditional. So in terms of methodology, of course, I'm not saying that we can forget about offline participant observation and ethnographic interview, but when I can go back to Alaska safely next time, I would like to use a saved screenshot like the one that I showed for photo elicitation interviews. So digital ethnographic research can be combined with offline ethnographic research. Due to the speed of internet connection, I was unable to do any video or audio-based interview. I tried to call, but it was too slow to continue a conversation. And in rural Alaskan communities, they use satellite internet services. So I would like to work with information scientists to understand more about the mechanism of the satellite internet services and see if there's any way to improve the internet connection in rural communities as long as people are willing to do that. Besides my digital fieldwork with my Alaskan friends, I had a chance to introduce a student who lives in Europe to my friends in Japan who practices shugendo, which is like a Japanese folk form of Buddhism. For the student, it was a kind of pilot interview for his research. I usually don't make a call at night for an interview, but the trend towards Zoom drinking party or Zoom nomikai in Japanese made it easier for us to contact digitally and casually interview them. So if we didn't encounter this situation, I would have never imagined call my friends elsewhere in Japan for more than 2 hours for interview and include a complete stranger who is someone who lives in Spain in our conversation. So this is something new situation that I experienced during the pandemic, and that's all for my initial presentation.
For your first 5 minutes. Thank you very much. That was very nice. And don't worry, there was a little problem, but you solved it. So, you know, we are worlds apart. They're, you know, continents apart. So thank you so much, Shiaki. So I will now pass the word to Daniel Miller. Welcome. I give you the floor.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for the organizing and also the invitation. Just to say also, we've just established a website called anthrocovid.com, in which anthropologists from all over the world are giving observations about the response to the pandemic. We have at least 50 already. As I mentioned, a couple of weeks ago made a little video about precisely this problem. And the reason is that we have like a cohort of, you know, PhD students who might want to be going into the field now. And I just felt this is this is terrible for them. You know, they got all their expectations and now they can't go. So the question really is there a way in which we can still imagine people doing perfectly comprehensive, insightful ethnographies, even if, and we just don't know right now, it turns out that they are never going to be able to get to the field during the period of envisaged ethnography. I have no idea how long this is going to last. And the point I want to make is what we're talking about then is not kind of, you know, the ethnography online. It is the idea of an ethnography, but done online. And I think to do that, I was going to make sort of 6 suggestions of how we kind of, it's almost about attitude that we need to envisage this as a successful possibility. And I think the first thing is to recognize that in anthropology, I think it's axiomatic that there is no such thing as a more natural form of communication per se, right? We're not surprised at the moment in our Japanese research that in certain cases, people find it easier to express things online because of all the constraints and etiquette around face-to-face. And I mean, just imagine 2 people, I don't know, 10 years ago, and sitting there, and one of them gets a phone call, and an hour later, the person turns around and says, gosh, you know, you're talking for an hour to your mum and it sounded terrible. I mean, what's your relationship to your mother like in the real world? Well, like nobody would have said that because we accept the telephone now as real. And principle number 1 is online is the real world. That's what it is. That's where we are. And we can, I think, be comfortable with that. Principle number 2 is that we don't have online versus offline here. We've always had a great range of contexts. We have the difference offline between going to somebody in their workplace and having dinner with them at home. So now, sure, you have a difference between being on WhatsApp with somebody or Line, as opposed to watching what they could create on TikTok. And as in any anthropology, we are able to compare the different kind of contexts. Obviously, I am talking about circumstances where people have relative internet accessibility and use, but that now is common for much of the world. Then I think the third thing is, I don't think of this as having to do interviews. I think the key is to understand that it is simply participant observation as we have always understood it. That is to say, you have exactly the same issues of long-term participation, getting active, helping people look after their kids online, whatever it is, gaining trust, gaining friendship, developing a whole field of relationships over a long period of time. And that is now possible in many instances online. The fourth thing I would like to say is that one of the books we did recently, How the World Changed Social Media, is about the cultural relativism of online, that every population does this differently as they would offline. And the implication of that is the anthropological study of the specificities of those cultures is just as possible through online communication and comparison as it would have been in offline. Fifthly, I think there is also an additional resource here that to some extent compensates for the loss of not actually being in the field, and that is the use and interpretation of this visual material. Because if you like, what's happened in human conversation is, we had oral, we had textual, now we have visual. And actually having a sensibility around, the memes and the images and the analysis of this material gives you a great, all sorts of possibilities for analysis and insight that we might not previously have had, and it is there online. But the last thing I'd say is this, which is we're not actually just talking about doing things online. We are also talking about doing this because of the pandemic, And therefore, it seems to me that all of us also need that particular sensitivity, that we are going to be dealing with people who may well be in conditions of claustrophobia or depression and all sorts of the other kind of deficits they suffer from. And it seems to me we also therefore need to be talking about how we remain sensitive to the very specific condition in which the people we are dealing with may be living under this particular moment. And that's my point.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Well, this was the first round of comments, and we still have Aida. Yes, we still have Aida. No, I didn't forget you. I didn't forget you. So now we have Mexico. Welcome, Aida, please.
Well, thank you very much. I just want to begin by saying that when Clara introduced me as also being a digital anthropologist, I almost laughed because I know that some of my friends are looking at this, and I'm one of the most uh, illiterate digital person. So I'm talking here. I don't even have Facebook. I don't have a Facebook. I'm a journalist, but I'm a very traditional. I'm an anthropologist, a PhD professor, and also a journalist, but a very traditional journalist. I do not have a Facebook for safety reasons. So I think that it's interesting that you can hear another perspectives from women that are entering into the field. And I work with people. I do prison anthropology. I work with people in prisons that do not have access to internet or even cellular phones. So how to be creative when you have this kind of work. So I think that I can also approach. And with the first question, of course, the first answer was to use the internet and the concept of digital ethnography or just ethnography, as Daniel Miller said, comes to mind. The first thing we did in the PhD program where I teach is to include a methodology class in digital ethnography in the syllabus. Since the pandemic started, we started to change the syllabus to include this. And I think I should take that course because I'm not the one that it's teaching. This is the new generation of younger scholars at Shiaki who are very excited about the digital ethnography. But I think that we also need to be more creative to be able to continue working with sectors of the population that do not have access to internet, as the inmates in the penitentiary system, as immigrants in detention centers, or even as rural and indigenous people in communities in isolated areas that do not have access to internet. And first, I want to complicate the question by adding, what are the challenges for activist research when you cannot do face-to-face participant observation? And at this respect, I would like to share my own experience working with women in Mexican prisons as an activist researcher. The first step was to get information through their families about the health conditions of the inmates and the health measures being taken by the authorities. The information allowed me to document that the prisons were not following the recommendations of the Ministry of Health about social distancing, sanitary measures. The overpopulation of prisons made it impossible that social distancing in a cell where 15 women have to share an 11 by 5 feet room and to constantly wash their hands when they have a water shortage, and 70% of the women prisons in Mexico do not have water in their cells. So with these conditions, we find out that some fundamentalist religious groups were entering into the prisons during the pandemia, and they were allowed to do so. So we called the authorities, and they told us they are doing that under their own risk. And they were not saying anything about the risk that represents for the inmates. So then I decided to enter into contact with other scholars that are working in prison settings, and also with activists that work for prison rights. And we start a campaign, a national campaign for amnesty for those people in prisons for not violent crimes. Women that were pregnant, inmates over 60s, and also women that were in prisons for abortion reasons, because in Mexico, abortion is prohibited. As a public intellectual, I started to write about it in the national newspaper that is called La Jornada. Under the pressure of this campaign, and also in alliance, we did lobby by phone with some senators that are progressive. One of them is the first indigenous senator that we have in the Congress, who was in prison, and I was part of the expert witness team that got her freedom. She was in prison for being part of a indigenous justice system. So I'm very close to her, and she was able to help me to push the lobby. And finally, 3 weeks ago, a month after the pandemia, we were able to get the amnesty for some of these inmates. We know that similar efforts are done in USA, where a team based in UCLA in the law school started a project called COVID-19 Behind Bars Data Project. and is making pressure to review files and ask for the release of vulnerable inmates. This is the activist part, but at the same time, I also contact families with whom I have previously had contact, because I have been working in this activist research project about judicial racism for many years. So I know a lot of the networks of the inmates outside. So through their families um, that I have contact before, we send them a clean artisan notebook that we call an empty book, because the project that I work with is a project of appropriation of creative writing by the inmates. And we also do artisan books with them. So we send them an empty book, and we send them also a series of topics to reflect about in their diaries. They could decide in the future if they want to share their writing in a collective workshop, or if they allow me to use part of their journal for public publication in a web page that we already have created with some young scholars to denounce what is going on in the prisons. And or if they just want to keep it for themselves as a tool of self-reflection during the quarantine, because after the amnesty there are new measures being taken, and they are not able to use like the common space right now, only for eating, taking social distance. The use of journals or diaries have been common as a social science research methodology. They have many books published about how to use a diary. Andy Alsaweski has reflected on this methodology in his book On Their Diaries for Social Research. And from the health science, Ruth Bartlett and Catherine Milligan have also explored the use of journals through their experience with people with mental illness in their book, What is a Diary Method? So we are specialists in diaries with our fieldwork notebooks also. But I want to clarify that this kind of methods require previous relationship of confidence that the activist research creates, in which the social actors assume that the sharing of their reflections around different issues will not be only to advance the academic career of the scholar, but also to give input for a shared project of social justice. There are also many other data sources that we can access through the internet to put into context the written text of these diaries. In our case, the hemerographic research has been basic to understand the challenge that the prison systems and the inmates are facing in this specific historical moment. We are also starting a new collective project about extreme and structural violences in the state of Guerrero. That is a Mexican state that has been deeply affected by militarization, by the organized crime, in the context of the so-called war on drugs. And in the context of this pandemia and the impossibility of doing field work, we're starting a collective database. And I'm learning to use this. Lola Figueroa is now connected. I saw her name. So we are starting to learn with this new generation how to create a collective database in which all of us can have input. And we are also, something else that I think it's important for some of our PhD students that have done a master thesis before and have done field work during their master thesis, and that is to go back to your field notes and to read them with a different perspectives, to reread the content of your old field notes with new questions, and also making our field notes, in the case of our collective project, making some of our field notes available to the other researchers. In the case of the new project that we are beginning, we are around 10 researchers that have worked in the state of Guerrero. We all have previous field work in the area in different issues of violences. So what we're gonna do with the database is that we are gonna enter part of the information that we already have to share it with the rest of the team. And I think that this is very important for different reasons. Also because it creates an academic community in a moment in which we need to build communities. And it's a way also to confront this neoliberal academia that is promoting the individual careers and is putting each other to compete. So in time of pandemia, to build knowledge in a community, it's a need, because we need to look for new strategies, but it's also a way to build an emotional community in which we can support each other through different generations, the new scholars that are entering to the field with the senior scholars as myself, to confront the new context in which we have to do research. And just to close, there is a huge debate that I'm not going to give here about what is activist anthropology, but it has been a lot in the Mexican context and in other contexts, a very positivist perspective that disqualify activist research for not being scientific enough. And I think that this pandemia put into the center of the debate, because on one hand, people are not going to allow you what Daniel Miller was suggesting, to stay through the screen seeing their life if they don't have a conviction that what you are going to do is going to help them for some kind of social justice. So it's not just like a decision that we take because we are good people. It's a demand that the social actors have, that what we do can contribute in a certain way to their social justice projects. So to be able to have their diaries, their journals, to enter into their intimate space through the camera, we need to make our projects relevant to their social reality they are living. Thank you very much.
Besides those questions that actually some of you addressed now, the fact that doing digital anthropology, we also have to build on all those themes and all those interactions of confidence, intimacy, and all the ethics that are concerned, that are part of that. I think most people, I've been reading the questions and the comments that people have been posting on the chat on the side. And of course, there are some issues that come up very strongly. And actually, it's very interesting because they relate to some of the issues that came up in our first webinar, which was entitled Culture and Public Health in the Era of Coronavirus, which is the issue of inequalities. We cannot, as anthropologists and as citizens of the world, assume that everyone has access to internet. Some people might even have the computers, might even have the tools, but they will have no connection. They cannot pay the bills, and not even talking. I mean, if you add to this all the situations like the ones Aida spoke about, people who are in jail, but people, imagine the refugees or people who live like in Alaska or in reserves for Aboriginal natives that have no access to internet. So this definitely, what we're discussing here today, really brings up again this issue of inequalities. People around the world don't have the same access to, unfortunately, they don't have the same access to health, to housing, and they do not for sure have the same access to internet and to, social media as a whole. So this is, I think, one of the main issues that has been brought up on the chat. And I totally agree. This is probably one of the most complicated challenges that we face, because we can very well do all this digital ethnography with populations, with communities, with people that have access to it, but not with others. And the second issue that comes up in the chat that I've been looking at here is students asking, okay, but how do we reformulate? Imagine we have a research project that is going into somewhere where you cannot really do it without being there. And sometimes they can just not reformulate it. It's not an option. So these are, I think, two issues that I would like our participants to address, or even now, you can either address these two main issues, or you can go back to some of the things that the colleagues just discussed.
Look, just on that issue of inequity of access to technologies, it's really It's a significant issue when convening consultation and decision-making processes that research help inform. That can really shift the power balance between parties and between different groups of people, and it's one of the real risks that needs to be managed as new communication technologies are being rolled out. What some land councils are doing, and in fact I suspect all of them will be doing, is investing some of the savings from the reduction in travel costs and associated with doing remote fieldwork and meetings, and reinvesting that into technologies and upskilling skilling of people to utilise those technologies, and that includes researchers as well as research collaborators. So I think that's a really key issue that's on everyone's mind as we move forward with that. Kind of returning to the question of what are the options for trying to do place-based field research and meetings at the moment. So there have been some video conferencing trial by some of the land councils involving large meetings that using Zoom or Microsoft Teams. That's happened in both remote community settings and also in urban-based settings, and that is in a large part enabled through the fact that in actually a lot of remote communities do have really great Wi-Fi access now. There's been a whole rollout of Wi-Fi towers and phone towers and the like. Most people have mobile phones, so so they're possible, but there's issues with sound quality, translation, facilitation of meetings is really tough in those circumstances, particularly if you can't if you can't get a facilitator in there and it's facilitating remotely. They're taking a lot more time. So a half-day meeting is taking 2 days to facilitate in order to really ensure that there's robust decision-making and consensus reached by everyone involved. Finding suitable venues is difficult. That enables social distancing. But they are finding that video conferencing is possible. It's not ideal, but it's possible at the moment. And they've very little choice, really, in the circumstances. GIS mapping tools are really something that I think are underutilised in the kind of applied work that we do, and upskilling of both researchers and research collaborators in the use of GSI tools, I think, are going to be really useful for mapping, trying to map at a distance, or even like sharing of mapping of survey outcomes if only fewer people can go out. So there's online portals that can be used on shared screens that you can really zoom into the details. You can add different layers of information on top. There's some fantastic tools. But again, it requires an investment to ensure that everyone can participate in the technology. GoPro cameras, maybe sending fewer people out to do work, but using video, GoPro cameras so that their experience is recorded almost like with a first person view, and that can be later shared and interrogated with both researchers and nutritional owners. Really important to ensure that there's recording facilities for any online interviews. It's really essential for accountability and review and record keeping. And I just would like to point everyone to a resource that's available online that's been produced by a sociologist called Deborah Lupton from the University of New South Wales. It's called Doing Fieldwork in a Pandemic. And it's a crowdsourced document that she's edited that's got some really comprehensive and fantastic information really the different possible ethnographic methods. Unfortunately, really not many that are useful to the challenge of place-based research or group work, but worth checking out anyway. So the online using online technologies such as video conferencing, some of the positives are that other than, in addition to completely eliminating the risk of participants contracting COVID-19, it is significantly cheaper. It's got the potential to increase participation and reduce the consultation and research burden, research fatigue for participants, because they don't have to take as much time out of their life to participate. So they're all real positives, but there's also quite a few negatives. In addition to the technological inequities, processes can take longer. The limited numbers that we're experiencing today, you hit the cap of 300 and that's it. And Deborah Lupton has actually done a brief review of the literature, which shows that shows it's optimal to cap focus group meetings or group meetings at 6 participants if you want everyone to be able to participate. Unfortunately, the kind of meetings that are required usually involve at least 10, sometimes scores or hundreds of people. So, you know, that's kind of going to compromise. It's a compromise on the method. And it's also harder to keep people in the room. So parties can more easily withdraw from a process if they're feeling aggrieved. It's harder to get them back in a virtual room than it is if you're actually in a face-to-face meeting. So that's particularly for researchers who are working on mediation and dispute resolution processes. And of course, for hearing or vision impaired individuals, online options are sometimes alienating. So I'm not sure what that's at. Where am I at with my time? 5 minutes. Yeah.
All right. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Pam. Actually, listening to you and just the final part of what you just said, I was just relating to what Luis Hoho, I think, wrote here on the chat, that he works with people with disabilities, and those people with disabilities are not able to use the social media and the internet tools as other people do. So that's also a problem. So in fact, I think that when we talk here about inequalities, and somebody else, Thomas, mentioned we should have a webinar on this, definitely. But the problem is inequalities, it's such, unfortunately, such a huge word with such a huge meaning that in these 2 webinars that have been directed to the pandemia specifically, we've been addressing different types of inequalities. In the first one, I remember we spoke a lot about inequalities in the face of the pandemia, like people who are stranded at home, women that are being abused, domestic violence, this type of refugees. So different inequalities in face of the virus and of the pandemic situation. And today we are trying to address inequalities as far as, you know, being able to do this work online and having, as you just said, and like Luis Rojo mentioned, people whom we cannot get through internet because they cannot have internet, they cannot use, or they don't have the means. So these inequalities are also there, and we have to address them and try to find solutions as anthropologists. So I will now pass the word to Shiaki.
Okay, thank you. Speaking of inequalities, I also encountered the importance of digital divide, where I know a very good detail of people's activities for some people, but for the other people, I have no idea. You know, some people just posted about going fish camping, fish camp for a while, and they disappeared for weeks. So I assumed that he went camping, but he actually went to mining camp for work. So I sometimes lost track of them because of some people have good access to the internet, while other people do not. And also, but before the pandemic, that the school library had the internet access, so everybody was able to be online. But because the school library is not cannot be used anymore, so that the people who are paying for the satellite internet service can go online. So this is definitely the situation that the social distancing causes the make that digital divide deeper. And as for my collaboration with international colleagues, I think that the time difference is also very important, in that when I talked with my Japanese friend who is practicing Shugendo, it was actually asked by my colleague in Canada to introduce his student, a prospective student who is living in Spain. So like we are working among 3 different time zones. And so still time difference was very difficult, but still it is very important for us to have international partners. The importance of counterparts are much more stressed nowadays, because because it's sometimes very difficult to adjust the time zones. And as I'm experienced right now, it's 11 p.m. almost here in Japan. And in Japan, digital technology, digital ethnography is not really discussed or taught in academia yet. So I'm now an assistant professor, but as a graduate student, I never received any training about digital ethnography and this kind of research methods. So I think I'm very interested in learning more about the experience other people have done and so on.
Thank you very much. I pass the word to Daniel. Daniel?
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, I think that one of the things one cannot even pretend one can do is provide internet access for people who don't have them. And this webinar includes, I think 3 of the speakers are talking largely about people where there are significant constraints, and it seems to be entirely appropriate that we are addressing those. But at the same time, I think it would be strange to ignore that for most anthropologists working in most situations in the world today, they will be working with people who actually do have internet access, but they still have very significant problems in having to somehow transform the ethnographies they had planned into this online. And I think it's also entirely reasonable to address those kind of issues. And I think that one also wants to be aware of just how widespread different kind of access is. I mean, my current project, we have ethnographies going on with migrants who are often amongst the major users of online precisely because they are migrants. We have work going on in Cameroon. The project in Uganda is in a very, very low income, what you might consider a slum, you know, mud houses basically. But people, not only is there a smartphone access, but actually, if you look at the transformations around the most important issues of poverty, there are often how do you support elderly people back in their villages from the people in the town. And it's all mobile money in this area of Africa today. And you would not understand inequality, and you would not understand poverty, and you would not understand any of these issues if you are not involved, not just in the question of how we gain online access, but the fact that they are using online all the time. And that's why I think this, you know, the research that we're doing is in many ways so relevant. So we also have to respect the resourcefulness of our informants, the way even those with difficulties and have ways of actually trying to gain access and do gain access, and we need to learn from that. A lot of our project is about essentially respecting the creativity of users in this world. Okay, I mean, that's one of the key things to me about the inequality, is not to assume it's just about, you know, what do we do, how do we use it? But if you go out there and you go online, you will see extraordinary activity going on for people with the, you know, who really cannot afford a full day's worth of access. You know, they have to turn off everything because every single message is a cost to them. But they are engaged. Most people are engaged. And I think we, if we're working in those communities, we would want to understand, respect, and convey that experience in our work. And that is really what we're trying to do. And I think one of the points I make, as I mentioned at the beginning of my earlier talk, that we have this website called anthrocovid.com. And in a way, I was talking about speculatively. What would you do if you had to start your fieldwork now? This website is more for people who had already carried out ethnography or had a relationship in a particular area and are following the response to the pandemic. And I'm sure there's over 50 responses there, and they are fascinating. And they actually show the sheer diversity of practices under these conditions. You know, whether it's a DJ, we have somebody talking about a monastery, conditions where you might not have expected these kinds of online interactions going on. But the people we are studying they're suffering from exactly the same problem we're discussing here, right? It's not just us who are having to go online, they're having to go online. And if you look at what's on that website, and you see, yes, sometimes it's people who are getting very lonely and very depressed and have issues of police brutality and all the other issues that we are familiar with as a direct engagement, because they can't go out for work, they can't get, the government's not giving food to them, etc., etc. But they are telling us about this online, and we are trying to respect those voices through the online ethnography we do. So I think that we're talking about our challenges, but they are the mirror image of the challenges that we will be studying if we engage with those populations online. And the final point is this, that people are talking about, well, issues of trust. I mean, what does it mean when you have build a relationship? But my point would be that that is essential in any kind of ethnographic encounter. That's why we do it often for 16 months and not 6 days. This is a gradual process, and it involves constant discussion and negotiation and learning sensitivities to the people we work with as they also learn about us and what we are trying to do for them and with them. That would be true online, but it has always been true offline, and we should be learning from those experiences and transforming it into this new environment, because of course it remains an issue. There will be differences in the way that operates, but those issues continue to, and we have lots of experience and much that we have learned about how we deal with those in the long-term experience of ethnographic practice. And that's something for the people who are just starting now. This is not going to happen overnight, but ethnography never did. We mainly work with a 16-month time frame, and there's a reason for that. And that would be my expectation of how online work would go. And I've no idea how long I've taken, but it's probably 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Aida, please.
Well, first I want to say, we anthropologists are always overcritical, but I was a little bit surprised that the questions that were sent were all like technical questions, like namely that the communication to do fieldwork was a technical issue. And some of the, I think Thomas something point out that Facebook is a corporation. And I think that there is also an issue of power. How do we use this new framework? One of the reasons why I do not use Facebook, among others, is that I have been involved in different expert witness reports against the military and linked to paramilitary groups. And my safety and my family's safety was challenged, and I cannot open, even when I know there are restrictions. Well, the issue is that I think that if we are going to enter more and more into the digital world, we have to look for alternative spaces outside the corporations. We have to include in our syllabus, when we are teaching digital ethnography, how can we use safety measures in the way we use these digital ethnographies. I think that all those issues of power and inequality that will frame the new scene for ethnography have to be included, not just as a technical issue, but as a power reflection of what it means to do fieldwork in this new frame. But because there were some technical questions that I want to address, but also to link to these reflections. One of the questions, one is the same thing to do, what the advantage or disadvantage of doing interviewing online? Are we gonna become armchair anthropologists? How are we gonna go back to the more systemic, what was the the word that I use, well, to more broader analysis instead of doing more case studies. There were some of the technical questions were there. And as we have said, the interviewing depends a lot of the trust that we have to build. And how do we build trust through the internet will mean other kind of strategies before we're thinking going directly to interviews. In the case, because we're thinking at two levels. What are we going to do now with the students that are going to the field? What are we going to recommend? And the other thing is, how is anthropology going to change? We don't know what will be the future of fieldwork in general. But I think that in more practical terms right now, the issue of with our students, I think that it will be a lot easier to start with institutional interviews before they go more directly with social actors, because they have to build that relationship with more time in order to use this. And I feel kind of uncomfortable with the question of, are we going to become armchair anthropologists? That was one of the questions, with the use of what is armchair anthropology. And as Daniel said before, after all, what we do as an anthropologist has to do with human communication that is basic in anthropology. And human communications can take many, many forms. So I don't think that it depends what do you mean by armchairs, but our ethnographic gaze will be always be a contribution to other social science. And I think that we should keep this ethnographic gaze that we can achieve through different methodological strategies. And we can also do an ethnographic readings of the archives. I think that that's something that is not the same reading that a historian will do. How can we take ethnography to review files, to review historical documents, hemerographical data, governmental reports from an ethnographic perspective? That can allow us to read not only the discourses, but also to read the silence in those files that we are accessing to complement and to put this kind of data into a cultural and political context. I think that that's something that we have to remember, is that to do ethnography has also to a lot to do with the thick description that Clifford had written about, and how can we get this thick description, having a different reading of documents and doing an ethnography of those files. In Latin America, people that are working in human rights have written about what is doing ethnography of human rights files, what it means, how do we address this. In summary, to use our training on cultural deconstruction to approach the different archives as cultural objects. We can also use the tool of visual anthropology, for example, to request our co-researchers in an activist research to videotape and to discuss together this kind of videotapes. And I think that, as I said before, a lot of those challenges will have a different frame if the kind of co-production of knowledge is, it has meaning for the people we're working with. See, if we are discussing the project together with the social actors with whom we work, and it is clear why it's important to do this kind of research, it is a lot easier for them to get a camera and do documentary film that we can use together. And in the same case of one of the questions, how to have access to unpublished documents, for example, was one of the documents. And as I said before, the importance of collaborative research in activist anthropology has given us the possibility, for example, to have access to digital archives of human rights organizations with whom we work. That's the case of this huge project that I was describing before that we are starting. The pandemic has shown us how the structural inequalities created by patriarchal capitalism and colonial legacies has deepened the impact of coronavirus in racialized poor communities in the world, making urgent and anthropological research committed with social justice and the co-production of knowledge through methodologies that include the concerns of social actors. But This activist alliance in the production of knowledge allow us to have access to certain sources of information that we would not have access from a positive distant research agenda that also takes into consideration the theoretical concerns of the researchers. Why a human rights organization will share with you a digital data because you want to theorize about legal pluralism. They don't care if your theory is very clear or not, if they don't see clearly how the access that you will have to their database will not jeopardize their work or will not contribute to the kind of work they are doing. This is the case of the collaborative research that I told you before about structural and extreme violence with a human rights organization of Tlachinola, with whom we started this project on racialized violences in the area. Part of the commitment of this research is to help them to organize the database of human rights violations of the last 10 years. With their trust and help, we are seeing the possibility of have access to their digital reports that are not open to the public. But this will mean a lot of ethical issues that we have to discuss together, a lot of safety issues that we have to discuss together. And in order to be able to enter into the digital archives, it has to be very clear what the final product of this database would be and what it has to do with their social justice project. And in the case of the government files on the subjects of human rights, for example, we could request access to the information that is not open to the public through it. In the case of Mexico, there is a transparency law that if they do not want to allow you to enter into their files, you can file a request through the transparency law. And we are using these kind of access tools to have to do that. And so they were concerned in this questionnaire of if we reconsider to go back to large data sets or survey. And I think that these methodologies have always been used in support to the fieldwork strategies in anthropology, and they should continue to be used. But we have to search for more creative methodologies to have a deeper approach to the voices and experiences of the social actors with whom we work. That's the ethnographic gaze that I was talking about. The contribution of anthropology can make these more sociological tools by putting into the center the thick description and that we can achieve through different qualitative methods, collaborative documentary film, focus groups. That's another tool that we can use when we have built this trust. How can we do focus groups through internet? Each of these tools are only tools. What anthropology can give is our ethnographic gaze, our cultural perspective, contextualizing all those cultural objects in the broader networks of power and culture in which they develop. And I think that that is something that it doesn't matter how communication takes place, we can continue contributing to a more complex analysis of reality through the kind of training that we have in which power and culture are always in the center. Thank you.
Okay, Aida, thank you very much. I've been, while you were talking, I've been checking the chat. So basically the questions that continuously come up are, of course, the ones that have to do with inequalities of access, of use of the internet, and not only the problem of internet corporations, which some of you already addressed. And some of the students are asking about ethical problems of using internet and other media. So we basically have these issues that Aida just addressed, but I would now ask the participants who wants to go ahead and address some more of these particular issues that have come up in the chat. It doesn't have to be in the same order. I just saw that, for instance, Liza Stefan in the chat mentioned how research participants and collaborators, how it is important that decisions about technologies, from diaries to Zooms, are made together with the people we are researching. So, and this of course has to do directly with ethics. So I don't know who, I think Daniel made the sign he wanted to go, and so I'll give you the word.
I very much agree with that statement. I mean, I think there's all sorts of ethics to do with compliance and to do with concerns over equality, etc. But I think fundamental here, to me, it's about sensitivity. And the sensitivity comes from, expanding what I was trying to say before, it's not that we're going on Zoom and we're going on Skype. The starting point has to be to learn what the population you are working with understand by those mediums. These mediums are created by their users in practices. And I think different populations use them differently, and getting sensitive to what they mean by them. What do they understand as privacy? What do they understand as harm? What does they understand as the developing etiquette of what is appropriate and inappropriate ways to use these media that you are conversing with? That's what we would have done if we were there working with conversation and other forms of interactivity. I still think it applies online. And for me, that is fundamental ethics. It's essentially about retaining our sensitivity, not losing it just because we're transferring into online rather than offline situations.
Thank you, Daniel. Anyone else wants to address this issues?
Yes, I just observed that yes, there's a wicked problem there about the fact that consultation is required in order to kind of develop and endorse new approaches to doing field research. But then how do you do that consultation in the first instance? And that's I just don't know how we kind of think our way out of that one. Yeah.
One comment that just came up on the chat, I don't know if you all can see it, but Leonardo Esteves mentioned, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how we can analyze critically what we can't observe or experience directly, which I think ties into what we were just discussing, how to make things happen together with the people we are researching.
I'm going to say the same thing about maybe too many times, but the only point I'd make is learn from our previous experiences. We never had access to everything that was going on in people's lives. We were always extrapolating from the encounters that we could have to the encounters that we couldn't have. There were always, as it were, externalities to research. This is not a specific phenomena to online research, and I think it is something we have always discussed and always had to do. And I think my point is, don't reinvent wheels. We actually should be contemplating what we have learned from those problems of extrapolation in the past and applying them to these domains.
Thank you, Daniel. I think something else that has come up a lot in the chat from students is this issue of how to solve the problem that they cannot shift research projects, and what should they do if they really can't do it, and if they cannot access through the internet, if they cannot do the field work that we're discussing here.
Well, in the case of our PhD program, we have a master and a PhD program in Mexico, and the students are supposed to start their field work in August. And so they are with this dilemma. They have their project and they don't know if they will be able to go to the field. I think that in that sense, it is so important to have a close communication with your dissertation advisor, to go back to your project and rethink how can you address the same kind of anthropological questions from different kind of files or archives. Just to give you an example, one of my students wanted to work with indigenous courts, and she wanted to do ethnography in these indigenous courts in the Maya area. It is very difficult that she will be able, the indigenous communities in many areas of Mexico are closing their communities to outsiders. And by August and September, to have somebody from Mexico City to go to a Maya community will be a risk. We don't know, we don't have a vaccine. So in that specific case, for example, we know that there were a lot of official documents that were recognizing the indigenous courts because we have a constitutional reform. And just before the pandemia, there was a series of big forums, state forums, to discuss in different indigenous areas the constitutional changes of customary law. And those forums were video recorded. And we are trying for her to have access to the forums and to analyze the discussions of the forums about the legal changes and to discuss all the documents that were related with the constitutional. Of course, it's not the same thing that do ethnography of the trials, but it's related to the same question that it had. The question was mainly how the state discourses were producing a new kind of indigenous law in their exchange with the practices, the local practices of justice, the capacity of production of state legality. So the question could be the same, but the approach has to be different. But I think that in order to do those changes, it is very important for us as tutors, as professors, to go back to the projects, to discuss together. And something that I think that is basic is to help the students get excited about the new strategies, to see this moment as a moment of opportunity. Because to start a PhD project depressed and sad because you cannot do what you can do, what you want to do, is going to be a failure. So I think that we have a challenge. We have two therapists also. We have to go to the projects, say they're relevant questions, they're great projects, you can approach them. Let's look how can you do that. Because if not, it's going to be the generation of COVID-19 that was totally depressed and couldn't do their dissertations.
Yes, you are totally right, Aida. Does Pam or Shiaki want to say something about this?
Shiaki?
You have to turn your micro. No, your micro is not on.
Okay, can I talk a bit? Sorry.
Yes.
It's a bit different angle, but I'm interested when we can go to field again. And as Aida also mentioned, that this is going to be a very crisis for our discipline as anthropologists. But for a younger researcher as I am, most younger researchers in Japan getting their jobs as teaching in fieldwork courses. So for us, it is I'm supposed to be teaching fieldwork method and bringing a student to Canada or like English-speaking countries and like experience them, having them experience participant observation or interviews. But all of these educational activities should be can be cancelled for at least for a few years. So for me, it is also a job crisis for younger researcher like I am. But also after this situation has changed and we might be able to go back to the field again, I'm very concerned about the prejudice, discrimination against East Asian persons from the like non-East Asian persons. And also some of my colleagues already experienced discrimination from the population within the countries because they were in Europe in February already. So some people were harassed by their neighbors or their relatives because they came back from Spain or France. So I think I'm also, even though in this panel many people are discussing about how to go online or use online technology, but I also need to think about how if the situation gets better and we can go back to this offline, like no regular research again, then we might also have to think about different kind of attitude towards East Asian people and East Asian researchers. And that's what I've been thinking nowadays.
Yes, yes, Shiaki, thank you so much. Did Pam want to say something? Because you were trying?
Oh no, except to observe that what I've heard is that from colleagues is that all kind of non-essential, that is sort of university PhD-based projects in remote communities. So in some of the more sort of isolated communities, certainly in the Northern Territory, that research won't communities won't allow that research to go ahead. I mean, that's the reality, is that students won't be able to propose and stand up projects that aren't deemed essential, just because it's just too risky for vulnerable members of those populations. So the only research that will be going ahead with those communities will be in the context of projects that the communities themselves deem to be essential.
Okay, thank you very much, Pam. Aida wants to say something?
Well, something that I was saying about the students, that how can we see this as an opportunity? I was thinking, Shiaki was saying about the new generations of young scholars that are competing in a very difficult academia, that do not have tenure, or in case of Mexico, do not have definitive positions. That I think that probably this gives us an opportunity to make changes in our institutions that we need to make. It is urgent because it's very interesting how we analyze inequality, how we are so concerned about structural power, etc. But our institutions have become neoliberal hubs in which the young people are being stressed to death to be able to produce, to get a tenure, to compete against each other, to not build community because you don't have time to build community because you have to publish or perish. And probably this is the post, we have to use this as an opportunity to build teams, intergenerational research teams, to support the younger scholars to do a different kind of research. The same thing that I say with the students, we have to, probably this is giving us an opportunity to stop, because what is interesting for me, I don't know how it's in each context is different, but Mexico has become so neoliberalized in the academia. You have to publish in English, you have to get certain kind of journals to, so we could not stop and organize because we have to be publishing and teaching and doing all those things. So now we stop and we are here for first time listening to my colleague from Japan who is suffering from xenophobia and who is a younger scholar. And so we have the chance to articulate and to make changes in our institutions.
Thank you very much, Aida. I think you gave voice to what all of us were thinking, that perhaps this pandemia, with all its bad effects, has some positive effects, which is to make us all rethink our place and the way we can join efforts to change things in the world, and of course in the academic world, very much so. Okay, we've been here 1.5 hours. Normally this is the time we give to the webinars, because longer than 1.5 hours, people, you know, it's complicated. And I understand that for our colleagues in Australia and Japan, it's very late. I really apologize, but to have this online at the same time, there's no other way to do it. And we have, of course, huge time differences. So I really apologize and thank very much to our two colleagues in the eastern part of the world. But just to finish, I know we've been discussing all this. I know there's a lot more to discuss, and a lot of the issues that have come up on the chat, and we've named and we've discussed some of them. Like I said, inequalities is of course a huge topic which needs to be addressed, but we have to think about this with time. We intend to continue these webinars, but perhaps once every month, perhaps once every 3 months. We have to see how it works and have colleagues from different countries and different anthropological associations participating. But just to wrap up, I don't know, perhaps really coming back to the topic of our students, because that's very important. It's very important, like Aida said, and Daniel and Shiaki and Pamela, to encourage our students not to lose hope if they cannot go to the field at this time. And so perhaps I don't know, perhaps in a sentence you could sum up what you would advise students to think or to do or to imagine? I don't know, just an idea, because I know a lot of them are here listening to us, and they need encouragement, and I think that's part of our duty to it.
Okay, well, maybe I'll just say briefly that in the longer term, land councils in Australia at least are expecting there to be a bottleneck around fieldwork as things return to normal, and projects are going to have to be triaged, but there's going to be a lot of work to do. So if you're a student who's particularly interested in doing applied research in this kind of area, the work's not going away anytime soon. So, you know, stay interested and keep exploring opportunities.
Thank you. Shiaki? Or Aida, doesn't matter. Go ahead, Shiaki.
No, I mean, I can't really think of good advices now because I'm also struggling. And I just try to do what I have in my with me right now. So I try to go on Facebook as much as possible. It's probably, even though it's armchair anthropology, it's still tough on my eyes. But I see what I'm going to come up with after maybe a year or two.
Thank you so much, Shiaki. Aida?
Well, I think that this generation that is about to go to the field or that is in the field right now have the challenge to use creative tools, and they will remember in 10 or 15 years as the generation of the COVID-19, and people will read what you did with a lot of interest and admiration because you were the ones that confront the challenge in creative ways. So there are many things, as I said before, our ethnographic gaze, the way we read files, archives, newspapers, is the contributions that we can give. And as long as there is inequality and oppression and all those problems that we are confronting as an anthropologist, we have something to contribute. So I don't feel discouraged. I'm sure that if you go back to your project, you will find a way to get this ethnographic gaze to a different kind of data, even if you don't go to this remote community where you were planning to go.
Daniel?
Right, well, in terms of taking heart, I mean, I'm in a slightly different position because I've been working as a digital anthropologist now for about 10 years, have supervised lots of PhDs, lots of projects that basically focus on the online world. And I would challenge anyone to suggest that these have been lesser or less insightful than any traditional anthropology. So we have a lot of experience in doing this. It has been done in exemplary ways. I think you can learn from that. And one point I was going to follow what Aida said earlier is in terms of the positives, this is also about disseminating back to the world, because our interaction it doesn't finish with research. We now concentrate on online as a way of getting our material back through blogging, through open access volumes, through free online university courses. I think that if this is recognized as opportunity, it does change our relationship, not only to our informants, but to the world that is interested in the findings of anthropology. And I think, yes, we should go for that.
Well, thank you very much. I have a last appeal, which I know has been an issue here in Portugal, I'm sure in many countries, which is, once again, the students who have postdocs or who have funding to do their research and are now strained and kept from doing their research, is for us who have a bit more power and are in positions in universities or institutions to really make the funders, the different institutions that fund the projects, to postpone the scholarships so that the students can really profit and use their funds later when they can go to the field, especially those who cannot do their work right now. And I think this is very important to do with the funding agencies in each country. So I want to thank you all very much, Shiaki, Pamela, Aida, Daniel, but also I want to thank everyone who's been participating actively in the chat, writing their comments, their questions, and it has been really interesting to discuss this, and we hope to continue with the webinars. And thank you very, very much for attending, and remember that this will be available online in the WCAA website, and you are welcome to go and look at it anytime, probably from in a few hours on. It's probably not available right now, but it will be in a few hours. Okay. Thank you very, very much, and see you in the next webinar.